When the sun sets over the Sahel, it no longer paints a picture of peace. Instead, it burns with a warning. The horizon that once glowed with the laughter of traders now shimmers with the roar of tanks. The children's playgrounds have become zones of drone surveillance. France claims to be fighting terrorism, but look closer. The guns do not point at distant extremists. They are aimed at the borders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Across the region, red dots mark the places where Western soldiers are now stationed, disguised under the banner of security cooperation. Yet, behind this veil of diplomacy lies an old blueprint of control, one that never truly left the Sahel. France didn't retreat, it reorganized. The encirclement is quiet, calculated, and cold, but in the heart of this tightening storm stands one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A leader who dared to break the chains of colonial legacy and stand for sovereignty. His answer to the empire's reach will not come in whispers. It will be in the sharp steel of defiance and the unyielding pulse of resistance. This is not just another headline. This is the countdown to Africa's reckoning. Before we dive deeper into this crucial moment, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss this powerful story of defiance and resilience. In 2023, the Sahel, once a land scarred by colonial footprints, took a bold, defiant stand. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger expelled French military forces, signaling an end to decades of influence and control that Paris had wielded in West Africa. The move wasn't merely political, it was a statement, a reclamation of sovereignty. The red flags that once waved in the breeze of French military presence were lowered. The final convoys of troops, captured by cameras leaving the Sahel's capital cities, made it look like an end had arrived. Western analysts nodded solemnly, declaring that a chapter had closed. But in Africa, no chapter closes quietly. The departure of foreign troops is rarely the end, simply the reshuffling of power. France wasn't retreating. Instead, it was repositioning. The soldiers that once lined the streets of Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey were now scattered along the Sahel's borders, their uniforms no longer in the French tricolor, but in the muted colors of European cooperation. This new presence was subtle, almost invisible, but its significance was undeniable. Maps began to change, circles began to appear. In Benin, French trainers were embedded with local forces. In Côte d'Ivoire, French reconnaissance teams accessed airfields that had been out of reach just months before. And in Sahel, drones had expanded their operations along the Mali border. To the Sahelian nations, the message was clear. The encirclement was real. But in the face of this creeping power, there stood one figure, a man who refused to submit to this re-emerging imperial grip. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who once spoke of breaking chains, was now at the center of a historical moment. The question was no longer whether the Sahel could resist it, was whether one man's courage could spark a movement strong enough to defy an empire's quiet resurgence. The battle for the Sahel had just begun. As the Sahel nations began to fortify their borders, there was one man who emerged as the face of resistance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His leadership was more than just political. It was symbolic of a deeper, more profound revolution. In a region long dominated by the shadow of French influence, Traoré's rise was the spark that could ignite a much-needed fire. The expulsion of French forces was the beginning, but it was Traoré's vision for the future that turned the world's attention to the Sahel. His message was simple yet powerful: sovereignty, not just in name, but in action. While France positioned its forces in neighboring countries, portraying their presence as part of a cooperative fight against terrorism, the people of the Sahel saw things differently. To them, this wasn't about security, it was about control. The French military had not retreated, they had only repositioned. Their new bases in Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and Sahel were not built to combat extremism, but to fortify their influence over the region. The narrative was clear. France had not left Africa. They had only changed uniforms. International and U.S. reactions. The response from the West was swift, but subtle. French officials continued to claim that their operations were focused on counterterrorism and regional stability. Paris emphasized its commitment to security cooperation in the Sahel. But beneath these diplomatic terms lay an unspoken truth. France's military presence in the region was not about keeping the peace. It was about maintaining its grip on the continent's resources and future. The United States, ever the ally of France in the region, echoed similar sentiments. State Department briefings praised the Sahel nations for their sovereignty, but warned about the growing influence of non-Western powers, particularly Moscow and Beijing. The West feared what might happen if these countries found alternative partners, if their rebellion against Western influence gained traction elsewhere on the continent. The United States' unease was not just about the Sahel, it was about the possibility of a larger African rebellion. Could other nations follow suit? Could this be the beginning of a continental shift? And yet, in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, the narrative painted a different picture. To the people, this wasn't a threat to security, it was a challenge to imperialism. It was about reclaiming the land and the future that had been stolen from them for centuries. Captain Ibrahim Traoré became the voice of this movement, and his speeches resounded across the Sahel. His words were measured, but they carried the weight of history. "We do not hate the West," he said in one televised address. "We simply refuse to kneel." The message was clear. This was not about seeking revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity. The people of the Sahel were not rebels. They were restorers. They were restoring their right to define their own future, free from the chains of colonization, economic exploitation, and military control. But behind the diplomatic niceties and quiet military operations, one question echoed louder than any other. Who would stand with the Sahel? Would the region's leaders be able to maintain their defiance, or would the weight of global pressure from the West crush their hopes of sovereignty? The world was watching closely, but what they failed to see was the storm brewing beneath the surface. The Sahel was no longer just resisting foreign influence, it was leading a revolution that would reverberate across the continent. And at its heart stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a man who refused to bend. As the Sahel's defiance against French and Western influence gained momentum, the battle was no longer confined to military standoffs or diplomatic summits. It had moved into the realm of narrative warfare. In the wake of the troop movements, Western media quickly began framing the Sahelian leaders as isolationists and militarists. Headlines warned of instability, while analysts speculated about the looming dangers of a terrorist stronghold in the heart of Africa. But the Sahel had learned to fight a different battle, a battle of perception. African broadcasters, on the other hand, painted a different picture. They framed the Sahel's leadership as guardians of sovereignty, champions of the region's right to determine its future. The contrast was stark, yet it underscored a critical point. The struggle for independence was not just a military affair. It was, at its core, a battle for control over the stories that defined the region. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his allies, this was a fight they could not afford to lose. As French drones continued to circle the skies and Western advisors quietly infiltrated the borders under the guise of security cooperation, the message from the Sahel was clear. We will no longer be defined by the West's terms. We will define our own future. Traoré's speeches, carefully crafted, yet brimming with the weight of history, spoke not just to the people of Burkina Faso, but to the entire continent. The words he spoke resonated across Africa, inspiring a new generation to fight for their right to self-determination. We are not rebels, Traoré said in one impassioned speech. We are restorers of dignity. His message transcended borders, resonating with young Africans in universities, military barracks, and town halls. This was a movement not of rebellion, but of restoration. A movement to reclaim what was lost, to restore Africa's voice on the global stage. The consequences of this resistance were felt not only on the political and military fronts, but also economically. France and its Western allies had long held economic sway over the Sahel, dictating terms and controlling access to resources. But as the Sahel began to forge its own path, the economic landscape began to shift. The people of the Sahel started to reject the dependency on Western capital and resources. In Burkina Faso, factories that were once owned by foreign investors were nationalized and repurposed to serve the local population. In Mali, state-backed mining companies began reclaiming gold deposits that had long been leased to European conglomerates. Niger, rich in uranium, began exploring new partnerships outside the Western sphere of influence, particularly with Russia and China. For the West, this shift was alarming. The Sahel was no longer just a pawn in the global economic game, it was becoming a player in its own right. French officials decried the nationalization of resources, warning that the Sahel nations were walking a dangerous path. But to the people of the Sahel, this was liberation. They had been trapped in a cycle of economic exploitation for decades, and now they were taking control of their own future. The exploitation of Africa's resources for foreign profit was no longer acceptable. And yet, the West's response was swift. Sanctions were hinted at, and the threat of economic isolation loomed. But the Sahel's leaders stood firm. They had learned a vital lesson. Survival would require resilience, both militarily and economically. They would not bend to the whims of global powers who had long viewed Africa as a resource to be extracted, not a partner to be respected. Perhaps the most insidious consequence of the Sahel's defiance was the psychological war being waged by Western powers. As African leaders and media outlets began to amplify their messages of self-determination, Western think tanks published reports predicting the collapse of Sahel governments. They labeled the resistance as dangerous, unstable, and prone to chaos. These narratives sought to undermine the Sahel's newfound sense of identity and unity, attempting to fracture the resolve of both the governments and the people. But the harder the West pushed back, the stronger the Sahel's unity became. The Sahelian youth, once skeptical of their leaders, began to rally behind them. Social media platforms flooded with hashtags like #WeStandWithTraoré, and artists began to compose songs celebrating the defiance of the Sahel's leadership. The resistance had moved beyond politics. It had become an emotional, spiritual, and generational movement. The Sahel was no longer just resisting foreign control, it was forging a new identity. In Burkina Faso, mothers whispered prayers for the success of the revolution in their marketplaces. In Mali, students held rallies in support of sovereignty, waving the national flag and chanting slogans of unity. The region was alive with the pulse of a new Pan-African spiritone that transcended borders, languages, and religions. But the fight was far from over. As the Sahel continued to build its alliances, both military and economic, the West began to escalate its efforts. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and even psychological warfare were all on the table. The Sahel's leaders, particularly Traoré, knew the cost of defiance. Yet the question remained: would the Sahel's resistance survive the pressure? Or would the West find a way to break its will? The next steps would not only define the future of the Sahel but the future of Africa itself. As the Sahel nations rallied behind their newfound sense of independence, the global stage began to shift. The United States, a long-standing ally of France in its African operations, had long considered the region a critical part of its geopolitical strategy. The Sahel was seen as an important battleground in the broader war on terror, particularly with the growing presence of extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But the rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the defiance of the Sahelian governments were seen as a direct challenge to the established order. While the U.S. expressed public support for the sovereignty of Sahelian nations, warning against the influence of non-Western powers like Russia and China, it was clear that behind the diplomatic rhetoric, there was unease. Washington's concern wasn't just about the presence of Russian mercenaries or Chinese investments. It was about the broader implications of the Sahel's resistance to Western hegemony. If the Sahel could successfully defy France and the West, what would that mean for the rest of Africa? Could other nations follow suit? And would the U.S. lose its foothold in a region it had invested in for decades? The Western narrative was focused on instability in the region. Media outlets and think tanks were quick to warn that the Sahel's resistance could result in a power vacuum, one that could be filled by non-traditional allies, including Russia and China. Washington wasn't simply concerned about the stability of the Sahel. It was worried about a ripple effect that could spread across the continent. The U.S. had long used its military presence in Africa to influence and stabilize regions of strategic importance. But now, the Sahel was rewriting the playbook, and the U.S. had to reckon with this new reality. The most significant fear for the West was the precedent being set by the Sahel's defiance. For decades, African nations had been subject to Western powers, whether through colonial rule, economic dependency, or military influence. The Sahel, by taking the bold step of expelling foreign military forces and asserting its own sovereignty, was creating a new narrative, one where African countries were no longer mere pawns in global geopolitics, but active agents of their own future. The United States, much like France, understood the power of precedent. If the Sahel could stand firm, what would stop other African nations from following its lead? If Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger could expel foreign military forces and reassert control over their resources, why couldn't Kenya or South Africa do the same? The very idea of a united Africa taking control of its resources, its economy, and its narrative sent shivers down the spines of Western leaders who had long considered the continent a resource-rich but politically unstable region that could be manipulated. The U.S. and its allies could not afford to let the Sahel's resistance stand as a symbol of success. As the region's leaders moved to further consolidate power and deepen alliances with non-Western powers, the question loomed: could the Sahel's resistance spark a continental wave of change, or would the West find a way to suppress this rebellion, restoring the old order under a new guise? The pressure was mounting, but the Sahel had already shown its determination. The world would have to wait and see who would blink first. The Sahel had already made history. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had expelled foreign military forces, and while some in the West called it a provocation, to the people of the Sahel, it was a victory. But this was not the end, and it was only the beginning of a new chapter in the struggle for African independence. The Sahel's leaders knew the stakes. They understood that independence wasn't just about removing foreign troops from their soil. It was about building a new foundation for the future that could withstand external pressure and internal divisions. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his allies recognized that the battle for sovereignty was not won by military means alone. The true power of resistance lay in the ability to unite the Sahelian nations under a common cause: economic independence, unity, and the rejection of foreign influence. The path forward for the Sahel required not just defense, but self-sufficiency. For too long, the region had been dependent on Western aid, foreign investments, and military presence. It was time to break free from this dependency and build an alternative vision for the future. One of the first steps was the deepening of regional alliances. The Sahel nations formed joint military councils, shared intelligence, and coordinated defense strategies. These alliances went beyond military cooperation. They were political, economic, and cultural as well. The Sahel's unity was becoming a symbol of Africa's ability to forge its own path without the constant interference of former colonial powers. The message was clear. The Sahel was not just resisting the West, it was creating a new vision for African unity and prosperity. As the Sahel strengthened its alliances, it also turned its focus toward economic self-sufficiency. Nationalization of key industries was one of the first steps. In Burkina Faso, factories previously controlled by foreign corporations were reclaimed by the state and repurposed to serve the local population. Mali followed suit, reclaiming gold reserves once controlled by Western companies. Niger, with its vast uranium reserves, began to negotiate new partnerships outside the Western sphere of influence, particularly with Russia and China. The Sahel's leaders understood that the region's future depended not on external investments, but on internal resources and the ability to control them. The narrative of African countries as resource-rich but economically dependent nations was changing. Now, the Sahel was showing the world that true freedom came from the ability to control one's resources, one's economy, and, most importantly, one's destiny. But as the Sahel charted this new course, it knew the challenges ahead. The West would not give up its grip on the region easily. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and even military pressure were all tools that the West could and likely would use. The Sahel's leaders had made their choice. They had chosen sovereignty over submission, defiance over dependency. But the question remained: could the Sahel sustain this path of resistance, or would the combined forces of the West be enough to break its resolve? The future of the Sahel, and indeed Africa, was no longer just about survival. It was about the struggle for a new identity, a new vision of self-determination. And as the Sahel stood firm, it was clear. This was just the beginning of Africa's great awakening. The Sahel has never been just a region. It has become a symbol of Africa's struggle for true freedom, sovereignty, and control over its destiny. What started as a military defiance against foreign influence has evolved into a larger movement, one that is reshaping the narrative of African self-determination. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the mountains of Mali, the Sahel has become a beacon of hope for nations across the continent. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and the Sahelian resistance is not merely about fighting off foreign military presence. It is about reclaiming the future, the resources, and the pride of Africa. As the region stands firm, The world is forced to confront the reality that Africa is no longer willing to be dictated to by former colonial powers. The Sahel is showing the world that Africa's future will no longer be shaped by outsiders, but by Africans themselves. It is not just about removing foreign forces from the land. It is about constructing a new vision of economic independence, cultural unity, and shared purpose. The Sahel is writing a new chapter, and this time, it is doing so on its own terms. The revolution is unfolding before our eyes. The Sahel stands at a crossroads. Will it continue to hold its ground against external pressures, or will the weight of global power break its resolve? Ibrahim Traoré's moment has arrived, and with it, the challenge of defining Africa's future. What do you think? Can the Sahel sustain its defiance, or will outside forces find a way to impose their will? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more insights into Africa's fight for independence and sovereignty.